Antonio Brown walking shirtless off an NFL field. Still doesn't feel real. One of the greatest receivers football has ever seen, leaving in the middle of a game while the entire world watched in confusion. And somehow, that wasn't even the craziest part of the story. Because for years, Antonio Brown was exactly what football wanted. Obsessed, fearless, relentless. The kind of player every coach claims to love. Until suddenly, everything started falling apart. The headlines became chaos. The locker rooms became tense. And the same mentality that made Antonio Brown unstoppable started destroying everything around him. But maybe the most uncomfortable part of the entire story is that football helped create it. People forget, Antonio Brown was never supposed to become Antonio Brown. He wasn't a 5-star recruit. He wasn't a first-round pick. He wasn't supposed to become one of the greatest receivers football had ever seen. But nobody in football worked harder. Stories about Antonio Brown's training became legendary. 4 a.m. workouts, endless route running, training sessions that sounded almost impossible. Because while other players wanted success, Antonio Brown needed it. And eventually, the obsession paid off. Antonio Brown didn't just become elite, he became unstoppable. There were Sundays where Antonio Brown looked completely unguardable, not fast, untouchable, like football itself had become unfair. The catches became ridiculous. The footwork became impossible. The confidence became overwhelming. And every week, the NFL rewarded him for it. The fame grew. The spotlight grew. The expectations grew. And slowly, football stopped being something Antonio Brown played. It became who he was. That's the part people don't always understand about greatness. The same mindset that creates legendary athletes can also isolate them from everything else. And the bigger Antonio Brown became, the more alone he seemed. Over time, Antonio Brown started carrying football like a weight. Every criticism became personal. Every headline became personal. Every moment of disrespect became fuel. At first, football ignored the warning signs because winning hides everything. As long as the touchdowns keep coming, as long as the highlights keep playing, as long as the crowd keeps cheering, people convince themselves everything is fine. But the cracks kept growing. Sideline arguments, locker room tension, frustration boiling over in public. And eventually, it stopped looking like competitiveness. Now it looked like something heavier. Because once your entire identity becomes tied to football, every loss starts feeling personal. Every criticism feels like an attack on who you are. And once the relationship with Pittsburgh collapsed, everything accelerated. The Raiders situation didn't feel dramatic. It felt surreal. The helmet fights, the practice absences, the arguments, the fines. Every week felt stranger than the last. And that's when football stopped laughing. Because now, one of the most talented players in the world looked completely unstable in public. And the entire football world kept asking the same question. What happened to Antonio Brown? But maybe that question misses the point entirely. Because maybe Antonio Brown became exactly what football rewarded him for becoming. Relentless, obsessed, emotionally consumed by winning. For years, those traits made him one of the most dangerous players in football, until suddenly, they became impossible to control. And when football finally started pulling away from him, Antonio Brown didn't seem to know who he was anymore. That's what made the entire story feel uncomfortable. Because underneath all the chaos, you could still see flashes of the player people loved watching, giving him another chance. Because talent like that is impossible to walk away from. New England tried, then Tampa Bay did. Tom Brady trusted him. The Buccaneers embraced him. And for a moment, it looked like football had saved him again. Antonio Brown was smiling again, winning again, catching touchdowns again. And when Tampa Bay won the Super Bowl, it felt like the perfect redemption story. Football loves redemption stories, but real life is usually more complicated than that. Because underneath the comeback, the instability never actually disappeared. The pressure was still there. The noise was still there. And Antonio Brown still looked trapped between greatness and collapse. Then came the Jets game, one of the strangest moments of modern sports history. Antonio Brown removing his gear, walking across the field, and disappearing into the tunnel. Felt bigger than football. Not because of the drama, because of what it represented. Millions of people watched one of football's greatest stars completely unravel in public. Some laughed, some were angry, some were confused. But underneath all the chaos, there was something deeply sad about it. Because this wasn't just controversy anymore. This was a person who seemed completely lost. And maybe that's why the moment still feels uncomfortable years later. Because deep down, people weren't just watching Antonio Brown leave a football game. They were watching someone fall apart in real time. And ever since that moment, the headlines never really stopped. Social media outbursts, legal issues, public controversies, erratic moments. Every few months, Antonio Brown returns the spotlight again, and every time, people ask the same question: what happened to Antonio Brown? But maybe the answer has been sitting in front of us the entire time. Football loves obsession. It celebrates obsession when it creates greatness. But once that obsession becomes unstable, football distances itself immediately. And suddenly, the same player once celebrated as unstoppable becomes a warning story. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. Antonio Brown is responsible for his own decisions, but football also helped build the environment that rewarded those extremes for years. The pressure, the violence, the fame, the non-stop expectations. Very few people experience that level of intensity without consequences. And maybe that's why Antonio Brown's story still feels unfinished, because underneath all the controversy, there are still flashes of the player football once loved, the receiver who could take over games, the underdog who outworked everybody, the competitor who refused to disappear, and somewhere between the fame, the pressure, the greatness, and the chaos, Antonio Brown stopped being a football player and became a warning. Maybe football saved him, maybe football destroyed him, maybe it did both, but one thing is impossible to deny. For years, Antonio Brown gave football everything he had, and in the end, football took everything right back.